The strait is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. That's shorter than the length of Manhattan Island. On a clear day, you can see both shores from the middle. A supertanker moving at 15 knots takes about 90 minutes to transit it. 20% of all oil traded globally passes through those 21 miles, not 20% of Gulf production. 20% of everything. The diesel powering trucks in Germany, the naphtha feeding petrochemical plants in South Korea, fuel oil keeping the lights on in Pakistan. One straight, 1/5 of the world's oil supply, every single day. No exceptions. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just an important geographic feature, it's the most critical 21 miles of water on Earth. And here's what should follow from that. A feature this critical, this exposed, this dependent on a single narrow gap between two shores, the world's most powerful countries should have built redundancy around it decades ago. Multiple bypass routes, pipelines across the peninsula, infrastructure to guarantee that no single choke point could hold the global economy hostage. They didn't. The United States has maintained a naval presence in the Persian Gulf since 1949. The Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain since 1995, holds one of the largest concentrations of military hardware in the world. Carrier strike groups, destroyers, mine countermeasure vessels, and an intelligence network that covers the entire Gulf Basin. The cost of sustaining this presence across bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE runs to somewhere between $50 and $70 billion annually by most independent estimates. And the strait is essentially as vulnerable today as it was in 1987. That's the question the numbers force. Why the strait matters, that part is obvious. But why a problem this well-documented, this economically catastrophic to leave unsolved, has remained unsolved after 3/4 of a century of American strategic attention, billions in infrastructure investment, and some of the most sophisticated military planning in history? The answer starts with geology. The Persian Gulf is a bathtub, 615 miles long, 150 miles wide on average, surrounded almost entirely by land. The Arabian Peninsula to the west and south, Iran to the north and east, Oman closing off the final corner. 8 countries share its coastline: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, and Oman, and all of them sit inside the same enclosed basin. The basin has one exit. The strait sits between Iran's Keshem Island and the Omani exclave of Musandam. At its narrowest, those shores are 21 miles apart. Traffic is organized into two 2-mile-wide shipping lanes, inbound and outbound, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. On an average day, 17 to 18 laden tankers are transiting in each direction. Each very large crude carrier holds roughly 2 million barrels of oil. The daily outbound flow approaches 21 million barrels. Global oil consumption runs at about 100 million barrels per day. One narrow gap, 1/5 of everything. The concentration of oils inside that basin isn't coincidental. The same geological forces that folded the Earth's crust to create the Persian Gulf Depression are the forces that generated the oil. The Zagros Fold Belt running along the Iranian shore created the anticlines where hydrocarbons migrated and accumulated over 100 million years. The largest concentration of easily extractable oil on Earth ended up inside a geologic box with one opening. No one designed this. No one chose it. The oil was here before humans had fire. What humans built on top of that geology is the vulnerability. Saudi Arabia recognized the exposure in the early 1970s after the 1973 oil embargo demonstrated how dangerous a single point of failure supply chain could be. By 2006, they had built Petroline, the east-west pipeline running 750 miles from the Ab-i-Ike processing facility to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Maximum capacity, roughly 5 million barrels per day. The UAE completed their own bypass in 2012. Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline runs 230 miles from Habshan to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast, outside the strait entirely. Capacity, 1.5 million barrels per day. Combined bypass capacity, approximately 6.5 million barrels on a perfect day with every pump running. Daily Hormuz flow, 21 million barrels. The pipelines cover roughly 30%. The other 70%, every barrel of Kuwaiti crude, every LNG tanker from Qatar, every Iraqi export load leaving Basra has no alternative. It simply cannot leave the Gulf any other way. Building more bypass capacity sounds straightforward until you look at the map. A Trans-Arabian pipeline extending to the Gulf of Aden would cross Yemen, which has been in sustained armed conflict since 2015 and before. A northern route through Iraq and Turkey already exists for Iraqi oil, but runs through contested Kurdish territory and carries Turkish political leverage as a permanent condition. A pipeline traversing Iran itself, which would be the shortest and most direct route to the open ocean, has its own obvious complications. The world spent decades identifying the problem, then discovered that every solution ran into a different geography, political, physical, or economic, that was equally intractable. One detail that stuck while going through the infrastructure studies: the cost estimates for a comprehensive Hormuz bypass ran into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The global shipping industry currently pays a few billion annually in war risk insurance premiums for Gulf transits. The world has, in effect, calculated that it is cheaper to pay the risk premium indefinitely than to eliminate the underlying risk. Whether that's rational hedging or the most expensive short-term thinking in economic history depends on what happens next. Iran watched this unfold for 4 decades and drew the obvious conclusion. The Islamic Republic's strategic doctrine around Hormuz is not about closing the strait. Closing it would trigger a military confrontation with the United States that Iran, by any conventional measure, would not survive. The doctrine is about threatening closure at precisely calibrated moments, enough to move oil prices, enough to generate political pressure on Washington and its allies, not enough to cross the threshold that triggers a military response that would end the leverage entirely. The 1987 tanker war was the proof of concept. During the Iran-Iraq War, both sides were attacking oil tankers to cut each other's export revenues. By mid-987, Iranian forces were mining the central Gulf, attacking neutral shipping with air-launched missiles, and generating insurance chaos across the entire oil market. Kuwait asked the United States to reflag their tankers under American colors, giving the U.S. Navy legal justification to escort them. Followed took the better part of a year. The U.S. swept mines, escorted convoys, eventually sank Iranian warships in a direct engagement. The operation was ultimately successful. It also cost over $1 billion, tied up significant naval resources, required new mine countermeasure vessels to be brought in from the Atlantic, and demonstrated conclusively exactly how effective relatively primitive harassment tactics could be against a vast superior naval force. Iran had its answer. You don't need to win. You need to make winning expensive. The 2019 tanker incidents were a graduate-level demonstration of the same doctrine, updated for the drone and mine age. Between May and September of that year, 6 commercial tankers were attacked or damaged in the Gulf of Oman and the Strait of Hormuz. Limpet mines were attached to hulls in port and at sea. Flying objects, almost certainly armed drones, struck two Norwegian-operated vessels and left damage patterns that took days to attribute. A Japanese oil tanker was hit while its owner was sitting in a formal meeting with Iranian President Rouhani in Tehran. A British-flagged vessel was seized by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy and held for 2 months while its crew remained aboard. No claims of responsibility were ever made. The United States and United Kingdom attributed the attacks to Iran based on surveillance footage of Iranian vessels removing unexploded mines from hulls, analysis of the specific limpet mine design, and detailed assessment of attack vectors. Iran denied involvement throughout. The market responded within hours of each incident. Insurance premiums for Gulf voyages spiked between 10 and 40%. Several major shipping conglomerates suspended voluntary Hormuz transits pending security assessments. Tanker spot rates. The daily cost of chartering a large crude carrier doubled, then tripled over the summer. Global crude benchmarks moved immediately on each attack announcement, regardless of the scale of actual damage. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Iran conducted 6 attacks on international shipping in under 5 months, demonstrating both capability and willingness to disrupt the world's most important maritime corridor. The United States responded with additional naval deployments, aerial surveillance flights, and the formation of an international maritime coalition. The UK sent a frigate. Japan, Australia, and several European nations joined patrol operations. And Iran's leverage increased because every military deployment Washington made in response to the 2019 attacks confirmed the same thing. American commitment to protecting the strait ran deep. American exposure to Iranian harassment ran equally deep, and Iran had found the one strategic asset that let it impose costs on a superpower without triggering the war it could not survive. The most surprising aspect of the 2019 crisis, looking back, isn't the attacks themselves. It's that they worked exactly as designed, produced no lasting change in Iranian behavior, no change in U.S. strategic posture, and no resolution of the underlying tension. The system returned to baseline. The leverage remained intact, and both sides knew it. Put yourself in the position of Iranian military planners for a moment. You have an economy of roughly $250 billion under comprehensive international sanctions. Your Air Force flies aircraft designed in the 1970s. Your surface fleet, in a direct engagement with a U.S. carrier strike group, would not survive the first hour of combat. Your one irreplaceable asset is a piece of water on your northern coast that you didn't choose and didn't build. The strategic calculation isn't complicated. Hold the threat intact. Exercise it just enough to remind the market it exists. Never cross the threshold that converts the threat into a war. The threat is worth more than the action. For over 4 decades, through the Shah's fall, through the hostage crisis, through 2 Gulf wars, through the nuclear negotiations, through the JCPOA and its withdrawal, through sanctions regimes of escalating severity, that calculation has held. The accounting is uncomfortable. Japan depends on Persian Gulf crude for roughly 85% of its oil imports. South Korea sources approximately 70% of its oil from the Gulf. China, now the world's largest oil importer, taking in over 11 million barrels per day, routes the large majority of that through Hormuz. India, the world's 3rd largest oil importer, is similarly dependent. These 4 economies are the 2nd, 3rd, 5th, and 6th largest in the world. Their industrial output, manufacturing capacity, supply chains, and consumer markets. A significant portion of all of it runs on oil that transits 21 miles of water that one country can threaten. The United States, transformed by the shale revolution, is now effectively energy independent. American direct imports from the Persian Gulf have declined from over 20% of total crude imports in the 1990s to under 5% today. The U.S. produces more oil than it consumes. American refineries use Gulf oil when it's competitively priced, not because they need it. The Fifth Fleet is spending $50 to $70 billion annually to protect a trade route that the country paying for it no longer depends on. The primary beneficiaries of American military spending in the Gulf are disproportionately China and India, two economies that compete directly with the United States for trade, technology, and geopolitical influence. Washington is providing a security subsidy funded by American taxpayers to the economic growth of its primary strategic competitors. We'll say what most strategic analysis leaves out. This isn't a design flaw in the current system. It's the product of a military posture built for a world that no longer exists. The Fifth Fleet was positioned during the Cold War to deny Soviet access to Gulf oil. When the Cold War ended, the infrastructure remained, because the inertia of military posture is almost always greater than the inertia of political change. By the time the United States became energy independent, the base agreements, the forward deployed assets, the alliance relationships, and the geopolitical signaling embedded in that presence had made it expensive to remove without creating a different set of strategic vulnerabilities. China has watched this situation patiently. Rather than competing with the Fifth Fleet directly, a competition Beijing could not win in the Gulf. China has spent 15 years building economic relationships throughout the maritime geography surrounding Hormuz. Gwadar Port in Pakistan, positioned at the Strait's western approach. Infrastructure investments in Oman and the UAE. Energy partnerships with Saudi Arabia and Iran simultaneously. A diplomatic balance the United States, committed to treating them as adversaries, has never managed. These aren't military assets, they're options. The ability to access and shape the region when American military dominance eventually recedes or becomes too expensive to sustain at current levels. Here's the take that will probably generate disagreement. The most strategically effective response to Hormuz vulnerability isn't more warships. It is faster decarbonization. Every barrel of oil demand eliminated from the global economy is a barrel that doesn't need to transit the strait. The most effective Hormuz bypass infrastructure ever built would be a global electrification of surface transportation. That's not an environmental argument. It's a security argument, and the country that understands it most clearly, China, which now manufactures roughly 60% of the world's electric vehicles and controls the majority of the battery supply chain that powers them, is already acting on it. Do you think the West's continued reliance on military solutions to Hormuz reflects strategic realism or strategic inertia? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a live debate inside American policy institutions right now, and it doesn't have a clean answer. Here's what the long history of the Strait actually teaches. Geographic choke points don't generate leverage because of what their controllers can do with them. They generate leverage because of what everyone else cannot do without them. Hormuz isn't powerful because Iran is powerful. It's powerful because the Persian Gulf is a bathtub with one exit, and the world put its most essential commodity inside it: Every major power in history that depended on the Gulf eventually had to accommodate this fact. The Portuguese discovered it in the 16th century when their spice trade routes ran through Gulf waters and required either Hormuz control or an Atlantic detour that added months to every voyage. The British Empire spent 150 years maintaining a Gulf presence, first through the East India Company, then through the Crown, specifically to manage the maritime choke points between Europe and Asia, of which Hormuz was the central one. When the British withdrew east of Suez in 1971, they created a power vacuum the United States has spent 50 years and trillions of dollars trying to fill. None of them resolve the underlying problem. The problem is the geology. Predates every empire that has tried to control it and will outlast everyone that tries today. Separates the current moment from every previous century is that an end date is now visible. The International Energy Agency projects that global oil demand will peak sometime in the late 2020s to early 2030s. After that peak, the decline is gradual at first, driven by vehicle electrification in wealthy markets, and then accelerating as electrification spreads through emerging economies. The projections have been revised upward multiple times as demand proved more resilient than expected, but the direction of the trajectory hasn't changed. On current forecasts, by 2040, the daily Hormuz oil flow will be meaningfully lower than it is today. By 2050, it may be a fraction of current volume. By 2060, it could be economically marginal, significant for some markets, but no longer the linchpin of global industrial civilization. This doesn't mean the strait stops mattering in the interim. LNG exports from Qatar, which also transit Hormuz, will remain substantial well past the oil peak, and the underlying principle of geographic leverage doesn't disappear with oil. It migrates. The materials that power the post-oil economy have their own choke points. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces roughly 70% of global cobalt, an essential component in current battery chemistry. China controls over 60% of global rare earth processing, including the materials essential for EV motors and wind turbines. The semiconductor fabrication capacity on which every modern energy technology depends is concentrated in Taiwan, secondary clusters in South Korea and the Netherlands. These are the Hormuz Straits of the next energy era. They are not 21-mile water channels, but the leverage they create is structurally identical, a geography that the global economy cannot route around, controlled by actors whose interests don't always align with the largest consumers. The power comes from having no alternative route. Do you think replaces Hormuz as the world's most important choke point by 2050? Leave your answer in the comments. We read every single one. The strait is still 21 miles wide. 17 laden tankers crossed it today. Another 17 will cross it tomorrow. The Fifth Fleet is still in Bahrain. Iranian speedboats still run exercises in the northern shipping lanes. Oil insurance premiums still pulse with every political statement from Tehran. And somewhere in the cobalt mines of the Congo, in the lithium fields of the Atacama, in the semiconductor fabs of Hsinchu, the architecture of the next choke point is already in place. Different geography. Same logic. If you want to understand how the physical world shapes economic power, why the places that look irrelevant on a political map often control everything that happens on an economic one, subscribe. There's more where this came from.